Thanks a lot for joining us here today on Market Day Report on RFD TV and Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM and the Sirius XM app. I'm John Jenkinson. The grain market is seeing quite a few gains here today. In fact, double-digit gains for the soybeans just a little bit ago. The only thing that's really in the negative category, earlier on anyway, was the Minneapolis wheat market. Let's go to the latest and find out. First, though, we did have that inspections report, the export inspection numbers that were released this morning. Now, last week, it was 1.38 million metric ton of corn that was inspected for exit out of the country. But this week, 996,643, just under a million. That wasn't a big drop. Sorghum was a little bit of a reduction from last week, 62,780 last week, 50,378 this week. But the number that really jumped was the soybeans. In fact, almost double here. This week, 1.16 million metric tons compared to last week's 594,363. And the wheat was just slightly higher, 450,980 compared to last week's 447,561. So overall, a mixed report from that export inspections numbers. What about the numbers at the trade? Right now, corn for December is on the higher side by 4.25 cents, 3.78, and that's a half a penny away from the high. March is up 4.25 at 3.90. November soybeans up 19.5 at 8.87, only a quarter of a cent away from the high here. January up 19.5. The rest of those contracts all 17, 18 higher. December Chicago wheat 2.75 cents higher. July is up 1. It's December Kansas City wheat up 1 at 5.25 The new crop July is up a half. December Minneapolis wheat, though, still on the negative side by 2 pennies at 5.94, and that's part way between the high and the low. Scott Gecas is at the edge of the trading floor in Chicago. Scott, this soybean market continues to gain strength here today. What are you hearing on the floor?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest reason why the soybeans jumped is because of that inspection number that came out earlier. Other than that, we were running into huge supply concerns. You got to remember that China still canceling shipments over there for the 4th straight week in a row. You know, weather's still in focus. Now you're starting to see snow in the Dakotas. That's going to limit a little bit of harvesting going forward. The USDA report is going to start to lower those exports. So with all that being said, you know, there's still a little bit of supply concerns that was, you know, offset by that little bump in those inspection numbers that came out earlier. But, you know, 370 or 875, I'm sorry, was, you know, that line in the sand that we were looking for. And as you've seen today, as soon as we popped above it, you've seen a bigger spike in volume and a little bit of continuation to running to the upside.
Did that also give a lift to corn?
Yeah, a little bit of lift into the corn. You know, corn's running into global tightening across the board. So, you know, that's an added positive catalyst into it. We're going to stay bullish in corn, particularly very well above 370.
Okay. Scott Gecas here with us. And when we come back, we'll be talking about the livestock trade next here on the Market Day Report. Let's check the futures before we go back to the edge of the trading floor at the CME Group in Chicago. First of all, the live cattle market. October is right now too higher at 112.35. Now, last time we were checking these markets, we were actually seeing a little bit of mixed action all the way across the board here, but it's December now up 60 at 116.75, and February up 37 at 120.72. Kind of interesting also here today, we see that the bids the asking prices are already starting to surface here a little bit. For the feeder cattle market, it's November down 75, 153.87. January down 95 at 148.80. So that enthusiasm over in the live cattle market has not spilled over into the feeder cattle market just yet. January, as I mentioned, down 95, and March down 102. For the hogs today, it has been higher. Several different factors at work here. December hogs up $1.72 at 56.72, and February up 165 at 63.87. Let's turn our attention back to Scott Gecas there at the edge of the trading floor at the CME Group in Chicago. Hog market here certainly setting the pace today.
Yeah, that's for sure. So the hog market is definitely leading the cattle market. But when you're looking at both of them from a fundamental aspect, and they're both running into supply concerns, usually when the third to fourth quarter production levels, they usually drop. In both cases, they're both rising. So that's definitely a concern. What we are noticing, though, is the spread between the cash and the futures in the cattle market is starting to narrow. So with that being said, we're going to keep an eye on that 116 level. That 116 level is going to be a major key support level. So if we can hold it, it's going to stay a little bit above it. But if we break that and we pierce that 116 level, I expect it to test anywhere between 115 and lower, with a huge spike in volume and a huge spike in volatility. So we're going to see how that plays out. You know, not to mention that in the cattle, the exports were off about 1,500 tons just from last week. So, I mean, that's definitely a concern. You know, going into the hog prices, you know, there's more and more and more cases of that African swine flu. Now there's reporting a case in Beijing as well as in a case in Hungary. You know, one of the biggest hog farms in China has about 20,000 pigs. They found a case of African swine flu. Now, if you remember when all this first came out, they said if 10% of the herd in China was going to be affected, that was equivalent to the world's supply traded all of last year. Now, judging by what has already came out, that is already reaching well above that 10%, at 15 to maybe 17% right now. So until those exports actually show up, you know, it's going to be waffling back and forth. As soon as those exports show up, I expect a huge spike in the hog market.
What do you think the trade is then thinking, Scott? Do you think that the trade is anticipating more cases will be reported then in commercial herds?
Well, it's got, I mean, as a trader right now, from all the news that is coming out, I think it'd be silly not to expect any more. So, I mean, you're seeing it come in every single day or every week on week. You know, with this African swine flu, there's no cure. So they have to call all the pigs that have to try to control it. It's very clear that they're not controlling it. It's already spreading to Europe, Beijing, as well as Hungary. So, I mean, until they can control it, I would expect a bigger bump in the cattle, in the hog market right now.
All right, Scott, thank you very much. Scott Gecas there at the edge of the trading floor at the CME Group in Chicago. Scott, have a good Monday. We appreciate your insight on all these markets.
All right, and we have